This is the land of Havilah, Joshua chapter 5. Israel has crossed the river. They're camping at Gilgal. Jericho is massively fortified just to the west of the camp. It must be less than 5 miles away because the plain is only so wide. But word of the crossing on dry ground has spread much farther than Jericho as we go to verse 1. When all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan westward, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard how Yahweh had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel until we had crossed over, their heart melted, and there was no more spirit in them because of the children of Israel. Comment: when Israel was on the other side of the river, King Balak of Moab was afraid of them because of their number. He said, quote, "Behold, a people has come out of Egypt that covers the surface of the earth." And, quote, "Now this people will lick up all that is around us as the ox licks up the grass of the field." Numbers 22:4. But on top of that, there have been several signs of divine assistance, such as the crossing of the Red Sea, the utter destruction of Sihon and Og, and now the river crossing on dry ground. So now the kings of the Canaanites, all the way to the Mediterranean 50 miles away, are melting in fear. Verse 2. At that time Yahweh said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time." Joshua made himself flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. This is the reason Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt who were males, even all the men of war, died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt, for all the people who came out were circumcised. But all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. Comment: because of what happened 38 years ago at Kadesh Barnea in Numbers chapter 14, Yahweh was angry with all the men of war except Joshua and Caleb, so he destroyed every one of them in the desert over the next 38 years. They were all circumcised, but they didn't please God. In verses 4 and 5, we have a very strange situation regarding the subject of circumcision. Circumcision is absolutely crucial to participating in the covenant with God, Genesis 17:14. Quote, "The uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." End quote. The men who came out of Egypt were circumcised, but they're all dead because they refused to do what Yahweh said. The men born along the way are all uncircumcised, but they've been blessed to enter the promised land. So we see an almost inexplicable situation in Israel now where Yahweh's hand was against the circumcised, but with the uncircumcised. But it gets stranger. In verse 2, Yahweh said to circumcise the sons of Israel the second time. But in verse 5 it says they haven't been circumcised even the first time. So how can they be circumcised the second time if they haven't been circumcised at all? We're seeing a message here. It's the message of Romans 2:25, which says, "If you are a transgressor of the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision." End quote. The men at Kadesh were circumcised but refused to obey, so Yahweh considered them to be uncircumcised. And the younger generation demonstrates Romans 2:26, quote, "If therefore the uncircumcised keep the ordinances of the law, won't his uncircumcision be accounted as circumcision?" End quote. The younger generation obeyed by entering the land, so Yahweh already considers them to be circumcised. So in summary, Yahweh considered the circumcised older generation to be uncircumcised, and the uncircumcised younger generation to be circumcised, though in the foreskins the situation was the opposite. Now that the younger generation have circumcised themselves by obeying Yahweh and entering the land as their fathers would not, he wants them to be circumcised a second time, as he said in verse 5, but this time by the circumcision of the foreskin. For us who are in Christ, Yahweh still requires circumcision as he always has since the day of Abraham, but it's the circumcision of walking in faith, Romans 4:12, as this generation crossed the Jordan in faith. So let's walk in faith and fulfill Yahweh's particular instructions to us, and we'll have the circumcision that counts, the circumcision that pleases God. In the covenant with Christ, that's the circumcision that counts. The circumcision of the foreskin is nothing, 1 Corinthians 7:9. But we're not going to get by unless we've circumcised ourselves with the type of faith that leads to obedience. Verse 6, For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, even the men of war who came out of Egypt, were consumed because they didn't listen to Yahweh's voice. Yahweh swore to them that he wouldn't let them see the land which Yahweh swore to their fathers that he would give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Their children whom he raised up in their place were circumcised by Joshua, for they were uncircumcised because they had not circumcised them on the way. When they were done circumcising the whole nation, they stayed in their places in the camp until they were healed. Yahweh said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." Therefore the name of that place was called Gilgal to this day. Comment: this is a play on words. Gilgal sounds very close in Hebrew to the verb for roll away. Yahweh has rolled away the reproach of Egypt. Having been a slave leaves a certain psychological stigma on a person, and it might be generations before the descendants escape the mental effects of slavery. The reproach, as Yahweh called it. But Yahweh says, "You have obeyed me, and I'm breaking it off right now. You will no longer bear the reproach of slaves. I'm breaking every effect of slavery off you." Obedience to Yahweh is not slavery, it's freedom. Galatians 5:1, quote, "Stand firm, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and don't be entangled again with a yoke of bondage," end quote. We see the Israelites camped and ready to conquer, and we know they don't have the attitude of slavery anymore. Verse 10, "The children of Israel encamped in Gilgal. They kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at evening in the plains of Jericho. They ate unleavened cakes and parched grain of the produce of the land on the next day after the Passover in the same day. The manna ceased on the next day after they had eaten of the produce of the land. The children of Israel didn't have manna any more, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year." Comment: it doesn't say where Israel got that fresh produce. It's Passover, which coincides with the time of the barley harvest, Exodus 9:31, so maybe they're going through the Jerichoites' standing fields of barley, or maybe they grew it themselves on the other side of the Jordan within the past few months. But anyway, Yahweh just withdrew the daily manna. Now without Yahweh's miraculous daily provision, they're going to be even more motivated to take the land. Their parents longed mightily for something other than manna, Numbers 11:6. But these children of theirs haven't known anything different until now. They're reaping the blessings of faith by eating this fresh produce. Now we come to a most interesting encounter, one of those rare glimpses into the unseen world. Verse 13, "When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood in front of him with his sword drawn in his hand. Joshua went to him and said to him, 'Are you for us or for our enemies?' He said, 'No, but I have come now as commander of Yahweh's army.' Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and asked him, 'What does my Lord say to his servant?' The prince of Yahweh's army said to Joshua, 'Take off your shoes, for the place on which you are standing is holy.' Joshua did so." Comment: verse 13 says this was a man, but obviously it was something more. It could be the angel that Yahweh mentioned to Moses, the one that would lead them into the promised land, Exodus 23:23 and 32:34. That particular angel was definitely not identical with Yahweh, Exodus 33:15. Or this could be Yahweh appearing in the form of a man, as he did to Abraham in Genesis 18 and to Jacob, Genesis 32. In verse 14, the being identifies himself as the commander of Yahweh's army. Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped him, and whoever this being was, he didn't correct Joshua for doing so, as the angel of Revelation 22:8 corrected the Apostle John. But whether it was Yahweh himself or an angel, we know that this being has one allegiance. When Joshua asked, verse 13, "Are you for us or against us?" the man answered, "No." What does that mean? It means he's not for or against Israel. He's there to do the will of God, period. And here we have an illustration straight from some sort of heavenly being about allegiances. The man couldn't say, "I'm for you," because at some point Joshua and Israel are bound to stray in their allegiance to Yahweh, and the man won't be able to go along with that. So we can only have one ultimate allegiance, and that's to Yahweh. We're not for or against anybody, period. God's message to Joshua is that I'm with you at the moment. Just make sure that you're with me. God cannot violate his righteous nature for anybody. He can only be with us insofar as we are with him. That's the chapter. Joshua 6 is next at landofhavilah.net. Joshua 6.